So this goes back to the residential listing agreement. We talked last week about if you're frustrated and having a hard time wrapping your head around buyers and BRBCs, one of the ways to combat that was to try to become a listing agent more than a buyer's agent. And so then it makes sense to follow into the RLA. So the very first thing to know about the RLA, and this happened about 8 months ago or so, there was a law passed that caps the length of a residential listing agreement for 1 to 4 units to 24 months. So you cannot have this written for anything over than 2 years. So what that kind of played into was I was talking to a guy, some of you may have heard, we were trying to do a future listings situation when you would give a buyer some credits from the lender in return for listing their house in the future. So we were doing listing agreements that were going to be perpetually long. And then when they come back to sell their house 5 or 6 years down the road, they would come back to you because you already had the listing agreement signed. So he can't move forward with that theory anymore because now the maximum length of a listing for residential 1 through 4, 24 months. All right. So that's first thing there. Let's go to the listing period. Before the listing period, we've always had it up here in the top part. When you fill out a listing agreement, the dates have been in that first paragraph. They're not in the first paragraph anymore. They're in the grid now. So beginning on certain date and then ending at 11:59 p.m. on the second date. Listing price, right? Nothing special. Property specific. So remember, this is for single family residents 1 through 4. When we move to residential income or five units or above, then we move to a commercial listing agreement. So this is all residential 1 through 4. And then we have our amendments as we've always had before, our addendums, right? Our manufactured home and our probate forms. So those are still there the same. Now, the part that everybody's always having fun with, the new compensation section. So this, I got a lot of notes in here. This is all changing now. So part of why we got into trouble was the fact that sellers thought that, hey, we're just paying our agent 5%, 6%, whatever the number might have been, X%, and not understanding that that agent was going to then be paying the buyer side. So a lot of confusion on where that money was coming from, where that money was going. Even though our particular listing agreement at that point in time was pretty clear, because there was still language in there that said that the seller was authorizing the broker to pay that cooperating commission. Just keep in mind, when that drives you nuts, that there are 50 states in the United States, which means there are 50 different listing agreements out there, which means this national case, I don't know what the rest of those listing agreements look like. I just know what California's look like. So as an attempt to fix that, the term that we're using is uncoupling. We are uncoupling the commissions. We are breaking them out. So the commissions are specific for every situation. So now we have, of course, now more options, right? Let me put Randy down here in the corner. Good to see you, Randy. All right. So we look at paragraph 2C1, compensation to the seller's broker. This is compensation for only the seller side of the transaction. This is us coming in, telling them, what are we going to present them? Let me see. I got to make sure my camera's on. It doesn't look like it's on right there. It's showing me for some reason. Yeah. Oh, well, we'll be fine. So compensation for the seller side of the transaction. You're coming in, you're telling your seller what you're going to be able to provide for them, what you're going to do for them, and in return, what are they going to compensate you? Okay, so whatever that number looks like to you. So no matter how it happens, no matter where the buyer comes from, I'm getting paid my seller's commission for doing my job as the listing agent. That's 2C1, pretty standard. And you notice there's not a box in front of that, because that's not like an opt-in, right? We don't have to opt in to getting paid for what we do. If you look at 2C2 and 2C3, they both have an opt-in box. What does that mean, opt-in? So we're talking about additional compensation to be offered to a buyer's broker. Is that mandatory?
No.
No. Has it ever been mandatory?
No.
No, it's never been mandatory. But nobody really has been aware of that. People have always considered it, yeah, it has to be mandatory. Of course I have to pay the other side. No, you don't have to pay the other side. So if you're going to offer a compensation to a buyer's broker, you have to opt into it. You have to check the box. And then a spot for what percent of the purchase price or a dollar amount, right? It's always either or. What percent of the purchase and a dollar amount. Let's go back up to when we're the listing side. Let's go back up one spot. Also, we can choose a percentage of the listing price or a dollar amount. What is the and for? Well, why would you ever put anything in the and section? So let's say it was 15% of the listing price and blank. What would you put in the and blank? Anybody have any ideas?
You put a TC fee?
TC fee, right? If you're going to pass the TC fee on to the seller, what about if your brokerage has transaction fee or a legal services fee, right? We have a legal services fee. We usually pick it up ourselves because we're nice agents, but we've had an agent in here before who's also transferred it to his clients. So he would put the $50 fee in there. So again, depending on how you want to structure your business model, you could put that fee in there. If you wanted to put the E&O fee in there, you could put that in there. So it's entirely up to you, right? What kind of fees you would put in there. And again,
What was
go ahead, Randy.
What was the TCP?
Right.
Oh my God.
So like for a transaction coordinator, so if you have a transaction coordinator helping you on this and you want your client to pay that transaction coordinator instead of you out of your pocket, you could throw that fee in there.
Okay. All right.
Any
So
other kind of
TC fee. I thought it was TCP initials. Okay.
Sorry, no problem.
I mean, so that's good, like for land listings and like little jinky stuff, right?
Could be good for land listings or janky stuff. I like that
Sorry.
term. Or think about this, guys. Let's say
Janky.
let's say you have a seller who's being very let's say frugal with what he's going to compensate you, and part of your agreement might be, okay, I'll list it, but you're going to pay for your own photos,
Yeah.
right? So maybe he's going to pay, if he doesn't want to pay out of pocket and he wants to put that into escrow, you would put that fee there. And then that would get turned in and you would get paid out of proceeds, get reimbursed for your photos. Okay, so back to the next one. So if you're going to offer a cooperating commission to the seller's or to the buyer's broker, you would do it in 2C2. 2C3, again, is an opt-in. This is an additional compensation to the seller's broker if the buyer is unrepresented. So how does a buyer become unrepresented? So when we talk about all buyers have to have a BRBC before they go show a property, is there anything in any law anywhere right now that mandates that a buyer must have representation to buy a house? No. So a buyer can still say, I'm sorry, I don't want representation. So then what do you do? Do you still take an offer? Do you still go under contract if a buyer doesn't want representation? Absolutely. Still got to sell the house. So as we get to the part of the language later in the form here, you'll see there is a form. It's a buyer non-representation form that the buyer would fill out. But what's going to happen? Does the buyer know how to write a contract? Does the buyer know how to use a form? Does the buyer know how to do inspections? If you send a bunch of disclosures to the buyer, is the buyer going to know where to sign them? Probably not. So you as the listing agent are probably going to inherit a lot of work, right? And even though you're inheriting a lot of that work, are you ever going to be representing that buyer at any point in time? No, you're not. But you still have to make the transaction move smoothly. So this is where we have a conversation with our seller and say, look, guys, if a buyer comes in unrepresented, I'm going to do more work. So if you are looking for additional compensation, you would put it in this section. And it would only come into play if there was no agent or broker representing the buyer. Okay, so you're not conducting dual agency. You're conducting single agency, and then you have an unrepresented buyer on the other side, but you're asking for additional compensation for the increased workload. Does that make sense?
So confusing because you're still Yeah, kind of
But
doing.
yeah,
both,
right, but what separates you then?
You're
from-
never signing an agency disclosure with that buyer. That buyer is on their own. They're unrepresented. If something comes up and they have a problem, I don't know, man.
Go talk to someone.
Go talk to an attorney. Good luck.
In that
Okay,
situation, the
so
buyer can be
you
like
don't-
screwed over.
So there's not gonna be a dual agency anymore?
No, there
There
is.
still is
It-
that.
It's
in the
coming up.
next one.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, C4,
this is
C4 right there defines
That's why
dual
I'm with
agency.
you. That's why I'm like, okay.
But our agency disclosure has a section where we have a fiduciary responsibility to help the buyer.
We don't have a
Also-
fiduciary responsibility. We have an ethical obligation
Yeah.
to act fairly, to represent the best, not to, to tell the truth, et cetera, to be honest, but we don't have a fiduciary.
Oh, I thought it was fiduciary.
No, the fiduciary
That's a-
remains
That's
with,
what I thought too, but
Yes.
now, right, it's just fiduciary if they, if you're doing dual. But if we're doing what you're talking about, where it's just, we're helping with paperwork, our fiduciary duty isn't. It's just
Correct.
to be
Is-
ethical.
it's just to be ethical.
Is this if the buyer doesn't want to be represented?
Yeah, the
or
buyer
if
has to-
Seller doesn't want to
No, the buyer has
pay you to
to,
double
the
end it.
buyer has to be non-represented and they have to fill out a form. A buyer non-agency form that says you are an unrepresented
So
person,
that's like the buyer just saying, I don't wanna pay for a,
100%.
okay.
Yeah, you might find VA buyers who choose a home where there's no compensation for a buyer's broker, and the buyer's broker says, hey, I'm not getting compensated, so I don't have to represent you, and they back out, and that VA buyer goes, but I really want that house, so now he's gotta go unrepresented. It's gonna happen.
Lawsuits, I see them.
Yes.
That happens because we're still liable.
Well, so
If
again,
we're the
well,
only realtor,
but
we're
you're
still
not
liable.
liable for the buyer's inability to do their due diligence. You're only liable for making sure that your seller discloses properly. And if you can prove, I disclosed properly, and hey, buyer, you failed to do your due diligence, that's on them, that's not on us. We're not responsible for making sure that buyer does his due diligence. And when we send him a notice to perform to remove his contingencies, and if he signs them away, it's not on us.
So then it would be in everybody's best interest to have a conversation with the buyer. Look, if you wanna go in on this
Yes.
unrepresented, here's all the things that can
Absolutely.
happen.
We,
Are you-
we have been very clear about this whole thing ever since we heard this was coming, that buyers need representation.
So what if the buyer's like, all right, fine, I'll pay you $100.
Okay, well then so we'll get into that.
Now,
Okay,
yeah.
we'll get into that. So now we're talking about 2C4. Dual, this is where we define dual agency. Remember before, dual agency, and it still is two agents from the same brokerage. As long as the broker is on both sides, we're technically in dual agency. So Julie has the buyer, Brooke has the seller, we're in dual agency. But we are specifically talking about in this agreement is if the same individual agent represents both sides, which is the kind of dual agency that we all obviously love, right? Because we get double paycheck. So Julie has both buyer and seller. So now you're opting into it and you're saying to the seller, okay, if I represent the buyer and I want to make a change to your compensation, total compensation, you're gonna do it in 2C4. Okay, if they don't fill this section out, this is where it gets confusing, okay? Let's say they wanna give, and we're just throw crazy numbers out. Let's say in C1, up here at the compensation, the seller's broker, they wanna give 10%. And then in C2, they wanna give another 10%. And then if they don't fill out C4 on dual agency and you bring in the buyer, how much do you get paid?
10%.
If you have a buyer representation agreement for 10%, then you're supposed to get 10% from the sell side and 10% from the buy side. Okay,
That's why I was like, yeah, I need help.
I'm gonna
Now-
watch this over and over again.
if I've told my client, okay, 10% for me to sell it, and I'm using big numbers so that we're trying to stay out of antitrust stuff. 10% for the sell side And then if I double end it, if I have dual agency, instead of 20%, I'll do it total for 15. Now I find a buyer and I have a 10% BRBC with that buyer and I bring that buyer in. This is where it gets super confusing. So now I got 10% from the seller and I got 10% from the buyer, but I've told my seller if I'm dual agency, I'll do it for 15. Now the seller only owes me 15. My buyer's still on the hook for 5. Does that make sense? Super confusing, right? A lot of math. Okay. So we can kind of reset the level here. Now, here's another thing. What about if my seller doesn't want to give any compensation at all to the buyer's broker? But I still want to get extra compensation if I double end it. So 2C2 might be not checked. They may have opted out completely of offering anything to a buyer's broker. So I might have 10% if I represent them in the sale, and then I might have like 12% or 15% if I have a dual agency. So there's a lot of options. Yes, go ahead.
So can they opt out if they wanted to opt out, but then you can still put, if there's dual agency, you know, if you double end it, you can still put in an amount there. Can you do it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it says, so if we look at dual agency, it says the total combined compensation shall be C1 plus C2. Now, if they have nothing in C2, then you can put or blank percent. So let's just say, let's try to keep it, let's just use some real numbers here for a second. So in C1, you have 3%, and in C2, you have 3%. So it's a 6% total. Okay. Or scratch that. Let's say they have 3% and then they have 0%. So it's 3% total. Now you could say the total combined compensation shall be C1 plus C2 or 4%. Right. So now you've increased it by 1% because they had 0 in C2. Okay. So there's so many different mathematical formulas and ways that you can add all this up. So it's going to be confusing. It's going to be confusing for a while. There's going to be a lot of mistakes out there. I can see just like, oh my God, I blew this, I blew that, I messed this up, I messed that up.
So Josh, I have a question.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
yes, yes.
So normally on a listing agreement, we just put down what our listing price is going to be. So it's 3%. And we don't know if we're going to have a dual agency or we're going to have the buyer wanting to do this or do that. So we're not going to be checking all of these boxes and filling them out unless we know what our buyer is.
Not necessarily. So your seller, right? Your seller is going to be the one who decides what all this is. You're going to have a separate agreement with your buyer when you bring them in. Your buyer is still on the hook for all of that money that you agreed to in your BRBC, minus whatever you will get credited from this particular seller. So you still have to set this all up.
Oh, that's right. Okay. So if we get a buyer that comes in for one of our listings, we have, of course, get a BRBC and determine all that and make sure that the seller is fine with it.
Yes, absolutely. So your buyer is still going to be on the hook for whatever agreement you signed with them. So again, that goes back to, we were having conversations last week about, you know, how many agreements are we, if we're going to be in typical dual agency, there's 2 agreements here. There's not 1 agreement. And so both agreements have to be satisfied. The one with your seller and the one with your buyer. And if your seller cannot cover all of the obligation of your buyer, then your buyer still has to satisfy that obligation. All right. Okay. Let's see where we are now. We're already spinning our brains. So, let me bring in Saren here real quick. Perfect. Okay, so we have compensation to the seller, compensation to buyer's broker, compensation if somebody's unrepresented, compensation if we are doing dual agency. So C5 is the total compensation. This is how much is going to be owed at the end of a transaction. So it's either going to be C1 plus C2 if the buyer is represented, which could be you know, 2+2 or 2+0, however they decide to do it. Or C4, if there's dual agency, right? Or the amount specified in C1 plus C3, which is 1 and 3 if they opt in, if we have an unrepresented buyer. So in C5, we're trying to break down the three different situations that you're most likely going to have. You're either going to have a represented buyer, dual agency, or a non-represented buyer. That makes sense? Kinda. I see a lot of confusion swirling today. So this is going to be fun. Okay, the next section, continuation right to compensate for brokers identified prospective buyers. So what is this part? This has always been in our contract before. There's always that one section halfway down the first page where there's a blank number of days. So this allows us to have compensation rights and broker rights after we cancel this contract. So the number of days that we put in here, and I don't believe at this point in time there is any limitation to this number of days, whether you're going to make it 30, 15, 45, 90, whatever it is. This allows you to provide a list of potential buyers to the seller prior to the cancellation of this contract. And it states if any one of those particular buyers comes back in, writes an offer, I now am the broker of this transaction and I get paid the compensation. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more below. The flip side of this is when you're taking a listing who's already been listed once before, you have to ask your seller, do you have obligations to pay a previous broker through their continuation period? Did they provide you a list of potential buyers? And if they did, then those other brokers and other buyers are listed in this section. Because if one of those buyers comes back within that continuation period, then we will not be getting paid and we do not have an obligation to represent. We step out of the transaction. Okay. All right, here's our MLS workaround. If the MLS states that we can no longer put compensation in the MLS, it didn't say anything about us putting in concessions. Concessions is completely different than compensation. Compensation is commissions. Concessions is closing costs. So again, your seller would have to opt into offering concessions. So if they check the box, the seller authorizes the broker to put into the MLS that the seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions. So we're just telling, yeah, write us an offer, ask us for closing costs. And it says we can define what that is. It's either an amount up to blank % of the purchase price or blank amount of dollars. Okay. Now, the language is very key here. It's an amount up to. What does that mean? Does that mean they have to give it all?
It means it can be less, but not past
Absolutely
that
less.
amount.
What about if they said, I'd be willing to give concessions up to 15,000, but an offer comes in and it's low offer and they're asking for 15,000. No, it's still a negotiation. They can still say, you know what? Because this offer was low, we'll give you 6,000. It's still a negotiation.
So that's not gonna hold,
Josh,
It's not going to hold them to it.
because if they don't get a full price offer or a good offer, why would they wanna offer up concessions that they can still fill this out, but not fill?
Correct. That's why it's an amount up to. And it also, look at the language, we're willing to consider those offers. So we're willing to consider those offers that you ask for concessions, and we're willing to consider those up to a certain amount. But we're not guaranteeing anything. The MLS is not guaranteeing anything. There's no agreement now because the MLS's compensation offer has always been, because as brokers, we have to sign documents when we sign up for an MLS that says whatever we post, we are contractually obligated to pay. That's going away. Right?
Josh?
We're no longer, yes, sir.
Josh, does this authorization need to be in the MLS?
So we're not quite sure exactly how the MLSs are going to restructure themselves, but we believe that they are going to be putting a concessions section in the MLS. We don't know if it's going to be a yes or no, or willing to consider, not willing to consider. We don't
Right.
know if there's gonna be a dollar amount yet. I think we'll probably be talking about a lot of that at the MLS committee.
We are,
hopefully,
that's on there.
on the agenda. Yeah, how are we
Okay.
in Rapid County and other systems going to build that part of the platform? We're not quite sure yet.
So I'll email that to you.
Got
too
it.
on the
Okay, then typical items included, items excluded, leased items, liened items. We'll talk about those later when we go down below. But I just wanted to point out, we've added a section specific to smart home features. Got a lot of problems with what is considered attached and what is not attached. If you have smart speakers that are mounted in the wall, you know, a lot of people want to take them with them because it costs hundreds of dollars each. Or specific kind of light fixtures that might control, you know, parts of your home, and you want to take those items. So now we got to be very specific on which smart devices stay or go. Next section, what is our primary MLS? Now, remember, according to the language below, the property will be marketed in the following MLS. If it's, you're supposed to put it in the one that's local to the property. Right, and if you don't, you need to specify that to your seller. So if you're taking a listing in Bakersfield and you're not a member of the Bakersfield MLS, you have to tell them, hey, I'm putting it in TAR, and oh, and by the way, that's not the local MLS for this house. The local MLS is Bakersfield, and I'm not a member. Right, you got to let them know that. So you're most likely to be putting TAR up here, and then the other ones, if you're members to multiple, where else are you going to be putting it? You list those ones in there as well. Okay, coming soon status. Seller so the defaults, the seller does authorize the broker to market the property for the coming soon status, or you have to check does not authorize the broker. So my question was, do we have a viable coming soon status here in our MLS? My personal belief on that is no, we don't.
Yeah.
It doesn't do us any good. We put it in as MLS. We can't tell anybody publicly that it's coming soon. Our current MLS status, our coming soon status right now only notifies other agents that we have a listing coming soon, right? And then as soon as we market it to the public, 24 hours, it's got to go live. So you really have to be careful when you do sign an SELM that you can't market it publicly, which means you can't put it out on Facebook and you can't put a sign in the front on the front lawn. The only thing you can do is tell your office and your sphere of influence, your mailing list. Those are the only people that can know. Because once they're on your mailing list or in your SOI, they're not considered the public anymore. They're considered your clients, right? Your potential clients. Put it out on public media or social media, it's got to go on the MLS right away. So be very careful how you do that. And there are people that get around that. How do we get around that? Well, I stand in front of the house and I never say where I'm standing, what street I'm standing on, what the address is. I just go, see this awesome house back here? This is coming on the market real soon. Give me a call. That's not really public marketing. So
Or
there's
posting it on a Friday and then working it the
yes,
whole
there's
weekend.
there's that one too, where they'll release it to the public on Friday. They have one business day to get it in the MLS. So that allows them to do Saturday and Sunday and not have to put it in till
Find your
Monday.
buyer within your office,
Yeah.
double end it, then you
Correct.
put it back up, and then we all call to say we want to look at it. It's sold. We already have something.
So again, the next section on public marketing, seller instructs the buyer not to market the property publicly. So we can't really do this one here in the way our MLS is set up. So if you do to begin on the date of this agreement or a blank date, and if you put it more than 48 hours out, you're in violation with the MLS. So if you're going to do it more than 2 days away, you have to use an SELM. So it would be this box over here to the right. Okay, excuse me. We are a clear cooperation MLS, so it defaults that we're a clear cooperation MLS. This is whether or not your seller, this is the SELI, the seller to exclude the listing from the internet. So they would have to opt into excluding it. Okay, because it defaults as the seller does allow us to put it in the MLS, does allow us to put it on the internet, because that's how we do 99.9% of our business. Okay, remember, we always default to the industry standard. Okay, presentation of offers, another really good area to talk about. Are you going to be presenting offers as they're received, as we normally do? Or are we going to be setting up we're going to release this on a Friday, And we're not even gonna present you offers till a Monday. That has to be discussed. That's not a decision that the real estate broker or agent can make on their own. That's a decision for the seller to make. So if the seller wants to do something like that, then it's here that you would mark it. Okay, defaults as we're not gonna give love letters. So they would have to opt into receiving love letters. And again, that's as a fair housing violations live here, right? This is a conversation we're having with our seller. If we accept love letters, we're asking for a fair housing violation. And I'm just letting you know, you want them, you get them. But our language in this agreement says if they opt into the love letters, our liability, it leaves. They're doing it against our advice. Yes.
Example, you receive a offer. The agent representing the buyer says, this is a young family that's just moving from Oregon and they lost their mother and we've got 3 children and they love this home and we just want you to know that they're excited. Now, that's not from the buyer, that's from the agent. Is that in violation?
It's in violation only if you relay that information to your seller and then your seller bases their decision to choose that offer over a different equal offer based on that information.
And how would that be?
Yeah, so how do you prove that?
Oh, it's super duper hard to prove.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is not a cut and dry slam dunk. The offended party, the second offer that was just as good or better, that didn't get chosen because maybe they weren't a family and found out, oh, this guy found out he loves kids and he's a grandfather and he chose them over us because of their familial status, that person would have to sue the seller. Or that person would have to sue the seller. So it's not, but you know, again, you're just putting yourself like playing with fire if you're taking these things. That's all we're saying here. You know, especially the ones when you get the love letter that has the photo, right? And I mean, I don't personally care, but it's a mixed race couple. They got kids from another country, you know, and then we have a seller, Don Peck was telling me he's got a guy in Bear Valley, doesn't want any kids on the property. I hate kids, you know, and I want to know where you're like, hey, dude, we're not even taking your listing. You're asking us to do a bunch of stuff we can't do, you know, so yeah, you got to be careful. There's that protected class. It's in the fair housing violation form that's bundled into our forms. There's all of those protected classes or statuses: gender identity, religion, familial status, marital status, veteran status, you know, ADA status. It usually is. I never understood that one either. Okay, next section, investigation reports. So look, guys, it defaults that your seller is going to pay for natural hazard disclosure when you take the listing. How many of us do that? Yeah, kinda, right? Some of us wait till we get under contract. This actually states that they're gonna do it when we take the listing, that they're gonna jump on and we're gonna get that NHD and get that done. You can also opt them into a bunch of other reports. Again, remember, these are written for all different parts of the state. This is the same form for all different parts of the state, where there are other parts of the state where they do all this ahead of time. If you are wanting to open a pre-escrow, you could check preliminary title report, right? And we get that starting to rock and roll. So we can get our natural hazard disclosure, our preliminary title report while we're in listing, not even under contract yet.
Right, but a lot of those are I default that the seller pays for when I write a purchase contract, so.
So you might as well just get ahead of the game. If you want them to do a pest inspection ahead of time, or your seller's really worried, man, I don't know, that septic, it was steel when I bought the house and I'm not sure what condition it's in, you could do an inspection ahead of time. But this just makes sure that your seller understands that they're on the hook for that money, right? They're opting into it. And it says here, they got to pay for those reports within 5 days of the beginning of this agreement. So they got to pay for them.
Hey,
Okay,
Josh,
this section, yes, sir.
quick on preliminary title reports. Sometimes you like to see, especially if the seller says, well, you know, we may have a cloud on the title, such and such and such and such. And the only way to find that out is to get a preliminary title prior to opening an escrow. You may be under contract, but you can't open escrow unless you have a buyer and a down payment and a valid contract. But my understanding is that the escrow will not supply a title report, and they want like $500 for one.
Correct. So this is why you would have your buyer. You can get a preliminary title report ahead of time. Escrow companies push back on it because it does cost money
I
for them to
understand,
hold
yeah.
that. And if you don't sell the house, then who's going to pay for that? So that's why they're always pushing it against pre-escrows. But if you're opting your seller into paying for it within 5 days of ordering it, you can get it. They'll open your pre-escrow for you all day if somebody's putting money on the table.
We just don't do that here. All the
Well,
ones
I
we do
understand
here
that,
in
but
Paso, we open
Open.
right when I give them the listing, we
Yeah,
open.
you open everything up. It's different in every area. That's just the way we happen to work here. In the Bay Area, they do all of their inspections before they even list the house. It's fully done. And the seller pays for everything out of pocket up front. So there's no set way. You know, we may have been in an area where it's been done a certain way for all these number of years, and we just assume that that's the way it's done. No, that's just the way that we've done it, and you can always push back, right? So when we had those guys at the tar office, there was an escrow company from down south, and they came up and they said, we open pre-escrows, and I went over to them and I was like, hey, I've been looking all my life for you. And Freed saw me and she pointed me on the shoulder and she goes, I'll talk to my people and see if we can open pre-escrows for you. And I was like, yeah, cool, thank you.
Would,
Go ahead.
would that be something also that you could, not that you would, but you could say counter back with a shorter investigation period? If you already have all these goodies?
Well, yes, if you already had everything except for, like, you could even do a home inspection if you wanted to. The seller can pay for a pre-home inspection and deliver it to the buyer. The buyer could
I
accept it.
can't see in any situation I've ever been in that you would want to do that. But if you
But you
want to
could.
get a really quick sale and you want to get it tightened up and it's
Mhm.
gotta go now, I mean, you could get all that done
Mhm.
and
And then when you go into a contract with a buyer, you press one button and everything is delivered on the first day. All your reports, all of your disclosures,
Yeah.
everything. Yeah, in a much shorter timeline. So in a competitive market, that could be a really good idea. And, you know, again, look at Southern California, Northern California, extraordinarily competitive markets where things are moving
Right.
fast. Okay, this section here, photographs. So all photographs are going to be in the MLS unless the seller instructs the broker not to take or use photographs in marketing. What MLS rules would, so let's say the guy wants no photos. What do we have to do? We have to take at least one shot from the street of the house. That's what the MLS requires. Can't have a listing in there without any photos at all. Okay. MLS instructions regarding photographs. So you got to let your seller know, hey, visitors are not restricted from taking pictures of the property. Okay, unless the seller instructs the broker to include an MLS term that only persons preparing appraisals or inspection reports may take pictures of the property. So this listing agreement does say that when your house is being showed, somebody might be taking photos of it, somebody might be taking video of it. And unless you specifically tell them not to, they will be. All right, so that's why when you see, you know, realtors on TikTok, and let me show you what you can buy for 400,000 and they're walking through a house, you don't have to get somebody's permission. It's nice, but you don't have to, because this already says that they can do that. Really key point, if your seller needs to buy a replacement property before they sell their house, this is where they opt into the SPRP, right? The seller's purchase of their replacement property, so that you know ahead of time what you're going into. The lockbox and the signs, default is yes, we're going to put a lockbox on. We're going to put a sign up, so they would have to opt out of it. All right, so let's get into some of the fun here. I did, you know, pretty basic on compensation here. Seller, this isn't changed really. I mean, the red language has changed only because there's some different language we have to use now. Remember, every time the old form said commissions, we've switched those all to compensation. All right, so always the default that commissions are negotiable. They're not fixed by law. They're set by each broker individually, and they can be negotiated. Seller agrees to pay broker as compensation for services. Okay, 2C5. Why 2C5? I thought it was 2C1, right? No, it's 2C5. This is what we're getting paid. This total compensation. It's the aggregate or the sum of all these things. Sometimes that might only be C1. If they don't want to pay an optional broker's commission, or if somebody is unrepresented, that's their choice. It could just be C1 in some cases, but C5 is what the total compensation is always going to be. So that total compensation, if, again, it talks about here, if C2C is checked, then the broker is being authorized to offer compensation to a buyer's broker. Pay the amount in 2C2. The seller is not required to authorize compensation to a buyer's broker to list the property on the MLS, right? Seller is not required to offer compensation. If any offer of compensation is authorized, it will not be specified in the MLS. So again, we're telling our seller, look, the MLS rules are different now. We're not putting anything in the MLS anymore. If in a resulting transaction, the broker represents both the buyer and seller, the amount specified in paragraph 2C2 shall be paid to the broker and credited against any obligation the buyer owes the broker. Okay, let me just make sure I read that right. Okay, so 2C2 is what I'm offering to the other side. Okay, so let's go back and read that. I think it was here. Okay. In a resulting transaction, the broker represents both the buyer and the seller. The amount specified in 2C2, what's being paid to the other side, shall be paid to the broker and credited against any obligation the buyer owes the broker. Sounds like dual agency, but what kind of dual agency is that one? Read it again. If in a resulting transaction, the broker represents both buyer and seller, what kind of dual agency is that? Is that what the kind that we mean when we were talking about dual agency up above?
Yes,
No.
no.
The type of dual agency we were talking about above is when the individual agent represents both buyer and seller. This is specific to when the broker, yeah, same office represents both buyer and the seller. So if Julie has the seller and Mariana has the buyer, Mariana's going to have a BRBC with 10%. And Julie's going to have her listing agreement where it says that she'll pay a buyer's broker 5%. So now I have two agreements here. The seller is going to pay the buyer side that 5%. So that's going to be credited towards Mariana's full 10% that she is being owed. That's all that's saying, is that I, as the broker, I got two agents with two agreements. That one is for 5%. This one's for 10%. So I, as the broker, I'm going to receive 5% from Julie. I have to credit that towards Mariana. I can't take Julie's 10% for the listing, 5% for the buyer, and then go and say, Mariana, you still owe me 10. She doesn't. It's credited towards her. So even in dual agency, when I'm the broker with dual agency, there are no discounts. It's still full. It's two agreements, and I get compensated for both of those agreements.
What the heck's the CDA gonna look like?
Oh, it'll be fine. CDA will be fine. It'll still just be total commission numbers. Okay, so then when we look down here, this is the section where we would talk about the different kind of dual agency. So the amount specified, okay, total compensation is there. Let me see where it is in here. Oh, it's here. It's under C2, agent under broker representing both sides. If the individual agent, we're here, if the individual agent represents both the seller and the buyer in any resulting transaction under this agreement, the total compensation the seller agrees to pay the broker shall be the amount specified in paragraph 2C4. So 2C4 was this number here. So what that means is if the individual agent is representing both sides, we only are talking about here. Okay, whatever this number is. And this number can be different things. This number can be either C1 plus C2, okay, this one plus this one, or whatever percentage I put in here. So if this is 3 and this is 2, then, and I represent both sides, I'm getting 5 unless I put 4 here. Yes, no? Maybe?
What are the chances of this being delayed even further after July?
Probably not. No, it's August 17th. August 17th is our day. August 17th. It used to be July, now it's August 17th.
I mean, I think it might keep getting delayed until they figure out the VA situation too, no?
Maybe, maybe.
I'm
But
hopeful.
yes, what's up?
I was waiting your kid.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Is it that important?
Yes, I need gas.
That's all it was?
That's all? Yeah, hey, I need gas too.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, we all need to
Give me,
fill up.
just sit here for a second. I'll do it in a second. All right. Jeez. Hilarious. I need gas. All right. Excuse me. Okay, so we'll go over some different possible situations for how people would get paid, and we'll try to use numbers that are safe. All right, so compensation. How is compensation earned? The seller shall pay the broker as followed if during the listing period or any extension, a broker or a cooperating broker, the seller or any other person procures a ready and willing and able buyer whose offer to purchase the property is accepted and escrow is closed. So that's always been the same as it was before, right? If any, so I have an exclusive right to sell, doesn't matter who finds the buyer, whether it's a different agent, it's myself, or it's the seller himself, I'm getting paid. It's an exclusive right to sell. Okay, that's always been the same. And then the continuation clause, which is 2 right here. If within the time specified in paragraph 2C6, so again, that's the section where you put in the number of days you want this to continue. After the end of the listing period or any extension or after any cancellation of this agreement, unless otherwise agreed, if that seller enters into a contract to sell the property to anyone who is known as a prospective buyer or a person related to that prospective buyer, and that person either physically entered the property and was shown it during the listing period, or for whom a broker or any cooperating broker submitted a signed and written offer, all right, then we come back into the transaction and we receive the commission, all right? But the only time this continuation clause works is if no later than the end of the listing period extension or cancellation, the broker or the agent, you guys, who the listing agent, must give the seller a written notice of the names of such prospective buyers. Okay, so this is really important that we do what when we take a listing? Write down the names of everybody that come in. We don't even do that right now. What do we write down? We write down the agents.
Yeah.
We go, so-and-so from whatever office showed your property.
Yeah, but we don't typically have their,
Why not?
we don't ask.
We don't ask. Oh, what other way could we get the names? If we required everybody to have a what before they go? No.
BRBC.
We required everybody to have a pre-approval or a pre-qual letter before you go show the house, send it to me. Now I got a list, right? If I got 7 showings and they all gave me a pre-qual, I got 7 pre-quals, I got 7 names. And then when my listing, which has been overpriced forever, goes to cancel and wants to go someplace else, and I have a 40-day retainer period, and I go, boom, here's all those pre-quals, here's all those names. And then they drop the price $50,000, and one of those buyers that kind of liked it comes back. Now we get it. Okay, does that make sense?
Oh,
I know it makes us have to work. It's really,
it's not, no, it's not
No?
that, it's not that. I just have these hopes that it's just not gonna get that complicated.
so this part's already that complicated. This part's already been, this continuation clause is not new. This has been there the whole time, right? But it does make us go back to this thing where like, we should be keeping track of who our showings are. And right now, we honestly, we do it the lazy way. We keep track of the agents and the days. We don't keep track of the clients.
Let me ask a question, Josh,
Yeah,
to the group there. On all our listings we've taken in the past, we always put that figure in there, 40 days, 30 days, 90 days. What's the consensus of the number of days that y'all use? I use 90 days.
Anybody even use that clause? I think a lot of people use 0 days. Honestly.
Is that right?
I've seen 30, I've seen as high as 180. Is the
Yeah.
worst one that I've ever seen. I think I saw one that a different agent used, and I think it was 180 days. I would say, 30, 45, 60. I think 90 is a little excessive, but it's up to you, right? It's really
Yeah.
up to you. And it really depends on how much effort you put into your listings and how well you track them. If you're not tracking them and delivering the names before the cancellation, then it really doesn't matter how many days you put in there. So let me ask you this question. So you've been putting in there 90 days. Are you keeping track of the names of all the buyers?
Not well, let's put it that way.
And are you delivering the names of those buyers when the contract's expiring? Are you
Well,
delivering to the buyers of the sellers? So then
no, never have.
Yeah,
Let's
if you
put it that
don't
way.
do that, then this doesn't even,
Yeah.
it has to be done. It's
Yeah.
not in addition to, it's an either or. You either give them the names or you don't, and you're either in or you're out. So,
So let's say we have you've called on a for sale by owner and they said, well, I want to try it myself for a while. So they go for 30 days and then they call you and they say, okay, I want to list with you. What about all the buyers that he has shown those properties to? Those are his. But if it's an exclusive listing, once you do get the listing, if one of those buyers comes back, can the seller say,
so that's a really great question. So he's saying there's a FSBO out there for sale by owner, and he's got it on the market for 30 days and he's had people come through. And then he's frustrated and comes to you and says, help me sell my house. I would say, because there's a section here, right, which is going to be right here. Okay. I would say this is when another broker, so it's a little bit different. This is more based on if another broker's had the listing. I would still say that somewhere in here, probably down in the is there an other section on this form? There's the other. It used to be like just a broad other, and I don't see that here. I'll have to ask the. Sorry for making you guys get dizzy. So this is interesting. This does, I would say here in maybe 2L under additional terms, you would, if he wanted to retain the right to represent himself, he would have to give you a list of all those people, the seller. The
right?
seller would have to give you a list and you would have to agree to opt out of representation and compensation if one of those original buyers came back.
All right.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's how I would probably look at that.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
Nope. I'm done.
Okay. You also get paid, and this has always been the same way. You always get paid if the seller is unable to perform, if the seller makes the house unavailable for showings and makes it impossible for you to show the house, you get paid, right? So anybody stops this transaction, you get paid. If the seller sues maybe a buyer and somebody blocked you from closing this transaction and the seller sues and receives money, you get paid out of that as well. So that's always been the same, all the different ways that we get paid. Okay, so I put this section in. I thought this was pretty important. This part that has the big box around it. Seller concessions. This is a whole new paragraph here. So seller concessions are defined as monetary payments that a seller agrees to contribute towards buyer's expenses and other costs a buyer is responsible for in the transaction. Right? Closing costs. Concessions may include, but are not limited to, the cost of escrow or title, lender fees, repairs, inspections. Oh, and look, broker compensation. Concessions identified in an MLS listing must
Oh.
not specify that concessions are to be used for broker compensation. So you can't say, we're willing to give concessions so you can pay your buyer's agent. Can't do it because that's just
Concessions.
commissions again. That's the whole reason you can't do it to begin with. So it cannot say specify that they can be used for broker compensation. Concessions must be allowed to be used for any permissible expense or cost. So when you give concessions, you have to give them freely and let them do whatever they want with them. You cannot define how they can be used. Okay, no problem.
Can a buyer say, oh, you're offering concessions and here's what we want? And
Absolutely.
You can say, yeah, no.
Absolutely.
Like,
So
I
there's
don't agree
nothing,
with that
there's
concession.
nothing in any of this that still does not prevent a buyer from asking the seller to pay for the buyer's obligations for anything. Whether or not, like I could call you and you could say, hey, we're not offering a cooperating commission or a cooperating compensation. But when I write the offer, I can still ask for it anyway. I can ask for it in the offer. I can check that box under 3Q3. It says, the seller, the buyer is asking the seller to directly pay the broker's commission and here's my BRBC. So I go, here, you're not offering me anything. I'm gonna make an offer to you anyway. Here's my BRBC. And during this negotiation, even though I know you wrote a listing agreement that says you're not gonna do it, I'm asking you for it anyway. And if they want to, they can, right? They still can.
That's confusing.
Yeah, it's confusing, but you can still do it. Right? This is just kind of like setting the framework, but remember, what is negotiable in real estate?
Everything.
Everything. If you remember that one thing, what is negotiable in real estate? Everything. So we're still going to be able to negotiate. All right. Here's a whole set, just like always was before, a section on items included, excluded, liened items that aren't owned, smart home features, which we talked about earlier.
Interesting. I got a counter offer on a property and it specifically said the bathroom mirror does not convey with the property.
They want to take it with them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just because it's a fancy, yeah.
Because it's defaulted on the contract that it
Right.
does convey.
I've never seen that before.
Yeah, they really like their mirrors,
Cause
so
it
they're
was
taking,
flown in from Italy.
taking it with them. All right.
See the damn mirror.
I happen to have these right here. Do you need them?
No.
So a whole paragraph on what a multiple listing service is. Now, if you look at this paragraph on multiple listing services, it says that all this stuff is going to be in here about your property, but except for accepting offers of compensation, we're taking those out. There will be no offers of compensation in the MLS. Okay, so again, we're very clear on that. It still talks about the benefit of using an MLS and the benefit of not using an MLS. This stuff is all basic, our public marketing, clear cooperation, coming soon status, SELM status, what data is going to be on the internet. That stuff hasn't changed. None of that's changed. All right, presentation of offers. There's some language in here. So there are different strategies for obtaining the best offer for the seller. The seller is advised that certain buyers may prefer not to be in a competitive situation and either may not make an offer. All right, if there's an instruction that all offers will be presented at a later date or time, or try to make a preemptive offer that will expire shortly, hoping that the seller will accept it before the presentation date. Right, so has that ever happened to you guys before? You say, showing start on Wednesday, offers will be presented the following Tuesday. You bring your buyer in on Wednesday and you want it and you write an offer and you make it expire in 24 hours. Right? Because you want them to answer it now. So that's that preemptive offer that they're talking about here. Why? Because a lot of buyers don't want to get into a competitive situation. So if you put out there that you're going to start showings on Wednesday and look at offers on Tuesday, you have to be able to tell your seller there may be some people that don't want to be competitive or get stuck in a bidding war, so they're not going to make an offer on your house at all. So it could be a strategy that backfires.
Right.
Okay, gotta have that conversation with them. Additionally, certain buyers may or may not be able or be allowed to pay compensation to a buyer's broker. Give me an example.
They don't got enough money. They can barely afford the house.
Or VA. right? VA buyers are not allowed to pay compensation to their broker. So these buyers may request the seller to pay the buyer's broker through a term or concession request in the purchase agreement or through a separate compensation agreement. So again, even if you're not offering anything, the contract, the RPA gives you a place where you can ask them anyway. So you need to have that conversation. You go, look, Bob, seller, yeah, I get it. You don't want to offer anything. That doesn't prevent somebody from asking you. And then it becomes a negotiation. You have to negotiate it. So these buyers may request the seller to pay a buyer's broker through a term or concession request in the purchase agreement or through a separate commissions agreement. If the seller has not authorized the broker in this agreement to pay the full amount the buyer owes to the buyer's broker or any amount, whether so it's let me reread that because it's so long, these sentences, sometimes I mess them up. Okay, if the seller has not authorized the broker, yeah, so if the seller, so that's what I was just saying. So if the seller has not authorized to pay enough money to the buyer's broker, okay, then the buyer themselves can still ask the seller directly to pay that. So what does that mean? I am a buyer and I come in and I have a BRBC and I'm obligated to pay 3%, but the seller has only offered to pay 1%. There's a 2% delta. There's a 2% gap there. The buyer can still ask the seller directly to pay that 2% gap. There's nothing that says that the buyer cannot still ask that seller. All right.
But they probably won't.
Why wouldn't they? They're gonna pay it on their own. You think these buyers out here, when they come across a delta, are going to just be like, yeah, cool, no problem, I'll pay it myself? No, they're gonna ask, they're gonna get a lot of offers asking for the seller to just pay it anyway.
So that's gonna be a tactic where they'll go, well, that person wants, an extra 4%, this one only wants this, so even though that price is more, this one's less, we more or less out of our pocket, so it's gonna turn into that.
Yeah, it's gonna turn into us having to break down all these offers, right? Each time we give them a net sheet, it's gonna have different compensation in it.
I'm stopping real estate. I can't.
You're out?
No, I'm not out.
Okay, so the seller is advised to discuss and consider the best strategy for the seller related to the presentation of offers. So this is just letting them know, like, how do we want to do these presentation of offers? So the broker agrees to present all offers received for the seller's property and present them to a seller as soon as possible, unless the seller gives the broker written instruction to the contrary. Okay, so the seller, and so it's either A, right? We either have to do it right now, or B, seller instructs broker not to present offers until a later time. So if you've checked previously that you want them presented at a later time, okay, but the broker will inform the seller that an offer has come in, but will not submit it to the seller unless specifically instructed otherwise in writing. Okay, so that's just kind of the way it is there. It's either we're going to do it all the time, as soon as they come in, or per the instructions of the seller. And even if the seller says, look, I don't even want to look at offers until Wednesday, when I get one on Sunday, I still have to let them know, hey, I just want to let you know, just got another offer. I'll see you on Wednesday. Okay. What about if I just had this the other day? Somebody emailed me on one of my listings and it's some investor somewhere and he wants to do a subject to offer. He wrote me a subject to offer, which means that my seller has to hold on to the mortgage as it is, and he's just going to make the payments on the mortgage, but he wants to transfer a title, right? The stuff that John does, a lot of the subject to stuff. It's a crappy offer. We're not going to do it. My guy doesn't want to do subject to. Do I have to present it to him still?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to
I do.
present everything,
I
right?
got to present it to him, even though it's a subject to, right? I got to present it.
A crazy person would accept one of those.
It's a very desperate one. There are desperate folks.
Yeah, because
That don't care. They just want the money and they want to leave. They just want $25,000-$30,000 and they want to get out of Dodge. And they don't care if it defaults and crashes their credit. They don't care. They're out there. They're definitely out there. Okay, a whole section on those love letters again, right here, right? Seller is advised not to do it. If you do it, you're doing it against our advice. Okay, let's go down a little further. Here, I thought this was really cool. So this is the showing properties. The seller acknowledges that the real estate broker must have a representation agreement with the buyer before showing properties to that buyer. Seller consents to the broker entering into buyer representation and broker compensation agreement with the buyer. And by doing so, the brokerage company will become a dual agent representing both buyer and seller. So yeah, if I'm gonna show, you have to tell your client, like if somebody calls me direct and they want to see your house, I have to enter into a buyer broker agreement with them, and I'm automatically gonna become a dual agency. Okay, and then right below it, the unrepresented buyers. If a buyer is interested in viewing the seller's property and is not already represented by a real estate agent, and such buyer refuses to be represented by a broker, then the seller is authorizing us, the broker, to obtain a signed document from that buyer who's refusing representation by a broker. The broker shall provide such buyers at the earliest practicable time a disclosure of non-representation, such as the buyer non-agency form or the open house property tour visitor non-agency disclosure form, the OHNA. So those are two new forms that we have. Buyer non-agency form and the open house visitor non-agency disclosure. So this is when a buyer is refusing representation to see the house, and they want to see the house anyway. You can tour them through the house. If you tour them through the house, you must not conduct any real estate activity. Just like an unlicensed person doing an open house. You can say, yes, the bedroom is this way. Yes, how much is it? I don't know. Let's go look it up on, are they willing to give closing costs? I don't know. You're asking me agency questions now. You're asking me real estate questions now. You just told me you don't want to be represented. So don't ask me those questions. You're on your own.
Right.
I'm serious.
No, I hear you, but it's like,
God, I would love to say that to somebody. If they don't want to pay you,
Yeah, you just told me you don't want to be represented. You just signed this form, and in this form, it says, I'm not going to provide you with any real
Yeah.
estate business,
go look it up.
right? I'm just going to tour you through the property, like Zillow's new
Why
tour
would you even,
agreement,
why would you even tour somebody through the property?
because you're trying to sell it for your seller. Right? This is when you have the listing, you're trying to sell it, right? And you may be getting additional compensation from your seller if you've signed this agreement that says you're going to get paid an extra percent when you have a non-represented buyer, because you're going to be doing more work, right? But you cannot establish agency. So how do you establish agency? Must you sign an agency disclosure to establish agency by California law? No, there's implied agency. Implied agency means you're doing the work of an agent for that person. Now you've created agency through implication, through your actions. So if you're doing all this stuff, if they're signing a non-agency disclosure and you're acting like an agent, now you've created the agency. So, yeah.
So is the buyer still on the hook then? I mean,
Buyer on the hook for what?
to
You-
pay you as an agent.
No,
if
because you don't
you're-
have an agency agreement with
Right,
them.
but you're still acting as an
You
agent.
shouldn't be acting as an
So
agent.
then
'Cause
you
then
need
you're-
to go
'cause
to the
then-
seller and be like, I'm acting as an agent, so you need to pay
Okay,
me.
so what does this say right here? This triggers 2C3.
It's triggering me,
So-
period.
Here's 2C3. What does it trigger? Additional compensation to the seller's broker, us, if the buyer is unrepresented. So hopefully, if you don't want to get triggered, you're triggering this box and you're putting a percentage in there. Right? You're saying, if you want me to do more work with an unrepresented buyer, I need to get paid. Right? I'm not doing this for free. So that section triggers this section. All right. See, I wrote myself little notes this time around, so.
I like that.
You like that better? Good. All right. And I think honestly, that was it. The rest of this agreement is all the way it's always been. I mean, there are little tiny, when you see red, these are changes. Why? Because now we have to, call back different paragraphs than it was before. If you look here, we have more paragraphs, so all these numbers are in red. So that's all those reds are, but see the language is all mostly black. This is all language that we've always had before on every other listing agreement. It's just the stuff in red that we really want to check. And the only difference now on all of our signature boxes everywhere We're asking for if the property is in a probate or a trust, you have to put the full name down, and if it's a probate, they also want the case number now on this sign, on this form. So, that's about the only thing that's been different. All right, any questions to any of this madness?
I'm gonna have to print it out, talk myself through it, then sit with
We
you.
might have to do
You
some
act-
role playing, honestly,
you
role
act
playing
like
as
the
a
client
buyer,
and
and a seller.
Explain it.
All right, so I'm in a listing